Welcome to the first episode in our book review series, or kind of book recommendation, as opposed to maybe a wholehearted review. So I think it's always good to be getting different sources of information, different ways of getting knowledge, from different areas, different authors, not just getting it from us all the time. So wanted to do this series for a little bit. So today's first book is The Art of Resilience by Ross Edgley. So today's book is The Art of Resilience by Ross Edgley, Strategies for Building an Unbreakable Mind and Body. So there's a couple of reasons I really like this book, and I feel like it'd be a worthwhile recommendation for a lot of people. So basically this book documents Ross Edgley. So if you don't know who Ross Edgley is, he is, I don't know if he's self-termed or has been termed a British adventurer. So he's done a lot of kind of long distance endurance events. He's like climbed a rope to height of Mount Everest, like just gone up and down. He's done like a triathlon with I think it was I think he did a log. He swam and did the whole triathlon with a log attached to him. Ross is in impeccable shape and he's a fucking unit. So this book is basically based around his adventure where he swam the entire island of Great Britain basically in one go. So he didn't set foot on land until he did it. It took him like 190 odd days or something like that. That kind of brings me to the first point why I really like this book. So I got it on Audible. I'm not sure why I chose Audible. I think it was one of the first books I use in Audible. I don't typically listen to a whole lot of books. A lot of the times Audible books are pretty hit and miss, but I actually feel like this book is much better off listened to rather than read. Ross kind of, he delivers the story very well. And that's probably the first point in this book that I really like, was it has a great story to it. So typically when we get these kind of performance books, these sports science books, they don't always have they don't have a story to them. I'm also listening to Legacy, so it's like 15 Lessons of Leadership from the All Blacks at the moment, and I'll get to that book at some point. But it doesn't really have a great story. It's got some good anecdotes to accentuate their points, but it's not a typical book as such. Like, there's not a journey from start to finish. It's got its leadership points, and there are certain style of books that people like, which is great, but I'm a big fan of a story. I've always liked reading, I've always enjoyed reading, I've always enjoyed stories. So I really like Ross because he goes through his whole journey. I think he said he wrote this while he was actually during the Great British Swim, is what he called it, and I think he wrote the book during it. So there's some detailed accounts of what was happening. He tells a great story, so it's very well written. I don't know if he got help writing it himself or he wrote it himself, but it's a great story. It's very well written. He documents it very well, but he also accentuates those points very well, and he's a good storyteller in the book. It's very, very high quality audio, as it should be, but it's not always the case with some Audible books. So the story is great, so it really helps you kind of go from, he breaks it down into different lessons in the chapters, and he kind of tells the story about the lesson. Then he brings up one of his points, like kind of references some things, and then you get a good kind of, smattering between education and entertainment with his stories and his anecdotes. So he goes through these lessons, so they're very, very good. I really enjoyed it. The particular story aspect, there's some emotional turns in the story, and if you follow Ross Edgley, you might know what I'm talking about. I won't spoil that for you, but it's close to tears. So the story of the book is fantastic, so I really like that. So next point I really like this is Ross. He's formally educated in sports science in some manner. I'm not too sure. I don't know that he mentioned Loughborough University, but there's a lot of good sports science reference throughout the book. So he goes through a lot of like psychological sports science, physical sports science. It's not just strength training. So obviously it's an endurance event. So he goes through a lot of endurance sports science. He references them a lot. He goes through, which is something that I found very interesting, was not so much the principles of sports science he was discussing, because I would agree with most of what he said, or would have been aware of those principles or implemented them, or they were kind of, some of them very basic. But what I really enjoyed was kind of the history of certain sports or sports science events or sports research that he gave. So he goes into things like the adaptation energy, or he goes into like the central governance theory. So all very interesting ones. He explains it very well in the book, and I won't go into them here, but he discusses these very well, talks about where they were. Some of these things I was totally unaware of. The first 4-minute mile, he talks about the pacers they use. So some really good sports science, coupled in with his good story. So it makes for a very, very compelling read. So if you compare it to something like, I'm also listening to The Carnivore Code by Paul Saladino. It's all science, and it's taking a long time to get through the book, even though I'm listening to it. So it's like a lecture series as such, which is not a bad thing, but Oh, sometimes it gets a little bit kind of boring. It's very easy, especially when you're listening to a book very often, you're doing other things. So if I'm cooking food or I'm driving, sometimes I'll just drift off and I'll not have listened to something Paul might have said in the last, few minutes, which is kind of an issue, but that's not for right now. That's a different fucking YouTube video. But whereas Ross's story is so compelling that when he brings in these smatterings of sports science, you're kind of a lot more invested in them, and it gives you a little bit more kind of way of digesting them, and it makes it a little bit easier to understand them. You'll be familiar with a lot of them when we talk about our videos, but Ross tells them in a very applicable way, so it's very, very useful. So I would definitely kind of, definitely it's worthwhile picking up on those if you're trying to want to learn a little bit more about performance. So he doesn't go into incredibly heavy detail. He just kind of touches on them, explains why it's relevant to his endurance event and why it might be relevant to your endurance event or whatever you're doing or whatever training you're doing it is. So it's kind of a nice kind of touch over them, so they're not very heavy concepts, but still with a good story. So the last bit, the kind of third point I want to bring up about Ross's book that I find very valuable for people, is that Ross's kind of Stoic philosophy, or kind of Stoic sports science as he kind of self-terms it in the book. So he talks a lot about his mindset and his research to do that. And I don't know if you have any interest in philosophy. I'm particularly not wholly interested in it, but I do enjoy some Stoicism. I do enjoy their concepts of philosophy, and he kind of touches through these and how they apply to sports science. Now that's kind of one of the reasons I like this, and it's kind of one of my first recommendations. Is it's kind of applicable to anyone kind of doing any form of training. We all go through difficult periods in training. We all have to understand that it's painful. And he describes these kind of lessons. And while someone is doing that with such an incredible kind of feat of endurance or feat of kind of physical exertion, it makes it a lot more kind of weighty. It gives you a lot more weight when you're listening to these kind of Stoic philosophies discussing. And he applies them to his own training and his own event. But he also applies them then to how he thinks about them. Some of them are like our modern day kind of, Stoics, or latter day ones like a Vietnam general. I can't think of his name right now. And then all the way back to like Plato and Marcus Aurelius and the usual cohort of Stoic people who are referenced, and he seems very well read on those, so he kind of distills them down. So if you're new to Stoicism, it's kind of a nice kind of segue into that, a little like dipping your feet into the pool a little bit. It kind of makes you think about them. It certainly made me pay a lot more attention than I previously had been aware of Stoicism. So I'd been aware for a very long time, but it kind of made me look into it a little bit more, do a little bit more reading on it, and it's certainly applicable. It's certainly a style of philosophy I enjoy. So it certainly helps with a mindset for training of not overreacting to events, but still being dedicated and focused. So Ross goes through all these principles very well. So I would definitely think this is worthwhile recommending. If you've already listened, let me know in the comments, because I'm very interested to see what people thought of it. If you haven't and you do enjoy Audible, it is well worth a use of one of your credits. I would definitely recommend it. Let me know if you want me to continue this series, if you enjoy this kind of thing, if you want to know about more books or more useful training. They won't all be Audible books like this. I'll do some weightlifting books or whatever it is you want to do. So let me know if you enjoyed it, and we'll keep going with the series. Thanks for watching, guys.